Okay, let's read today's 10. "We come to get you well," Emmett said in a chorus of yas from the other men. Henrietta didn't say a word. She just lay her head back on the pillow. Suddenly, her body went rigid as a board. She screamed as the nurse ran to the bed, tightening the straps around Henrietta's arms and legs to keep her from thrashing onto the floor, as she'd done so many times before. Gladys threw the pillow from her lap into Henrietta's mouth to keep her from biting her tongue as she convulsed in pain. Sadie cried and stroked Henrietta's hair. "Lord," Emmett told me years later, Henrietta rose up out of that bed wailing like she'd been possessed by the devil of pain itself. The nurse shooed Emmett and his brothers out of the ward to the room designated for colored blood collection, where they donated 8 pints of blood. As Emmett walked from Henrietta's bedside, he turned to look just as the fit began to pass, and Gladys slid the pillow from Henrietta's mouth. "That there's a memory I'll take to my grave," he told me years later. When them pains hit, looked like her mind just said, "Henrietta, you best leave." She was sick like I never seen. Sweetest girl you ever wanted to meet, and prettier than anything. But them cells, boy, them cells of hers is something else. No wonder they could never kill them. The cancer was a terrible thing. Soon after Emmett and his friends visited at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on September 24th, 1951, a doctor injected Henrietta with a heavy dose of morphine and wrote in her chart, "Discontinue all medications and treatments except analgesics." 2 days later, Henrietta awoke terrified, disoriented, wanting to know where she was and what the doctors had been doing to her. For a moment, she forgot her own name. Soon after that, she turned to Gladys and told her she was going to die. "You make sure Dave takes care of them children, Henrietta." Oh, sorry, everybody. Henrietta told her sister, tears streaming down her face, "Especially my baby girl, Deborah. Deborah was just over a year old when Henrietta went into the hospital. Henrietta had wanted to hold Deborah, to dress her in beautiful clothes and braid her hair and teach her how to paint her nails, curl her hair, and handle men. Henrietta looked at Gladys and whispered, 'Don't you let anything bad happen to them children when I'm gone.' Then she rolled over her back to Gladys and closed her eyes. Gladys slipped out of the hospital and onto a Greyhound back to Clover. That night, she called Day. 'Henrietta's going to die tonight,' she told him. 'She wants you to take care of them kids. I told her I'd let you know. Don't let nothing happen to them.' Henrietta died at 12:15 a.m. on October 4th, 1951. Part 2, Death. Chapter 12, The Storm. There was no obituary for Henrietta Lacks, but word of her death reached the gay lab quickly. The Guy lab quickly. As Henrietta's body cooled in the colored freezer, Guy asked her doctors if they'd do an autopsy. Tissue culturists around the world have been trying to create a library of immortal cells like Henrietta's, and Guy wanted samples from as many organs in her body as possible to see if they'd grow like Gila. But to get those samples after her death, someone would have to ask Henrietta's husband for permission. Though no law or code of ethics require doctors to ask permission before taking tissue from a living patient, the law made it very clear that performing an autopsy or removing tissue from the dead without permission was illegal. The way Day remembers it, someone from Hopkins called to tell him Henrietta had died and to ask permission for an autopsy, and Day said no. A few hours later, when Day went to Hopkins with a cousin to see Henrietta's body and sign some papers, the doctors again asked about an autopsy. They said they wanted to run tests that might help his children someday. Day's cousin said it wouldn't hurt, so eventually Day agreed and signed an autopsy permission form. Soon, Henrietta's body lay on a stainless steel table in the cavernous basement morgue, and Guy's assistant, Mary, stood in the doorway, breathing fast, feeling like she might faint. She'd never seen a dead body. Now there she was with a corpse, a stack of petri dishes, and the pathologist, Dr. Wilbur, who stood hunched over the autopsy table. Henrietta's arms were extended, as if she were reaching above her head. Mary walked toward the table, whispering to herself, "You're not going to make a fool of yourself and pass out." She stepped around one of Henrietta's arms and took her place beside Wilbur, her hip in Henrietta's armpit. She said hello. Mary said hello back. Then they were silent. Day wanted Henrietta to be presentable for the funeral, so he'd only give permission for a partial autopsy, which meant no incision into her chest and no removal of her limbs or head. Mary opened the dishes one by one, holding them out to collect samples as Wilbur cut them from Henrietta's body: bladder, bowel, uterus, kidney, vagina, ovary, appendix, liver, heart, lungs. After dropping each sample into a petri dish, Wilbur put bits of Henrietta's tumor-covered cervix into containers filled with formaldehyde to save them for future use. The official cause of Henrietta's death was terminal uremia, blood poisoning from the buildup of toxins normally flushed out of the body in urine. The tumors had completely blocked her urethra, leaving the doctors unable to pass a catheter into her bladder to empty it. Tumors the size of baseballs had nearly replaced her kidneys, bladder, ovaries, and uterus. And her other organs were so covered in small white tumors, it looked as if someone had filled her with pearls. Mary stood beside Wilbur, waiting as he sewed Henrietta's abdomen closed. She wanted to run out of the morgue and back to the lab, but instead, she stared at Henrietta's arms and legs, anything to avoid looking into her lifeless eyes. Then Mary's gaze fell on Henrietta's feet, and she gasped. Henrietta's toenails were covered in chipped, bright red polish. When I saw those toenails, Mary told me years later, I nearly fainted. I thought, oh, geez, she's a real person. I started imagining her sitting in her bathroom painting those toenails, and it hit me for the first time that those cells were being working on all that time, with all this time and sending all over the world. They came from a live woman. I'd never thought of it that way. A few days later, Henrietta's body made the long, winding train ride from Baltimore to Clover in a plain pine box, which was all they could afford. It was raining when the local undertaker met Henrietta's coffin at the Clover Depot and slid it into the back of a rusted truck. He rolled through downtown Clover, past the hardware store where Henrietta used to watch old white men play checkers, and onto Laxtown Road, turning just before the shack, where she danced only a few months earlier. As the undertaker drove into Laxtown, cousins filed onto porches to watch Henrietta pass their hands on hips or clutching children as they shook their heads and whispered to the Lord. Cootie shuffled into his yard looking straight into the falling rain and yelled, "Sweet Jesus, let the poor woman rest. You hear me? She had enough." Amens echoed from a nearby porch. A quarter mile down the road, Gladys and Sadie sat on the broken wooden steps of the home house, a long pink dress draped across their laps and a basket at their feet filled with makeup, curlers, red nail polish, and the 2 pennies they'd rest on Henrietta's eyes to keep them closed for the viewing. They watched silently as the undertaker inched through the field between the road and the house, his tires sinking into puddles of red mud. Cliff and Fred stood in the graveyard behind the house, their overalls drenched and heavy with rain. They'd spent most of the day thrusting shovels into the rocky cement ground, digging a grave for Henrietta. They dug in one spot, then another, moving each time their shovels hit the coffins of unknown relatives buried with no markers. Eventually, they found an empty spot for Henrietta near her mother's tombstone. When Cliff and Fred heard the undertaker's truck, they walked towards the home house and helped unload Henrietta. When they got her into the hallway, they opened the pine box, and Sadie began to cry. What got her most wasn't the sight of Henrietta's lifeless body, it was her toenails. Henrietta would rather have died than let her polish get all chipped like that. Lord, Sadie said, Henny must be hurt something worse than death. For several days, Henrietta's corpse lay in the hallway on the home house doors propped open at each end to let the cool, wet breeze that would keep her body fresh. Family and neighbors waded through the field to pay respect, and all the while the rain kept coming. The morning of Henrietta's funeral, Day walked through the mud with Deborah, Joe, Sonny, and Lawrence, but no Elsie. She was still in Crownsville and didn't even know her mother had died. The Lax cousins don't remember much about the service. They figured there were some words, probably a song or two, but they all remembered what happened next. As Cliff and Fred lowered Henrietta's coffin into the grave and began covering her with handfuls of dirt, the sky turned black as strapped molasses. The rain fell thick and fast. Then came long, rumbling thunder, screams from the babies, and a blast of wind so strong it tore the metal roof off the barn below the cemetery and sent it flying through the air above Henrietta's grave, its long metal slopes flapping like the wings of a giant silver bird. The wind caused fire that burned tobacco fields. It ripped trees from the ground, blew power lines out for miles, and tore one Lax cousin's wooden cabin clear out of the ground, threw him from the living room into the garden, then landed on top of him, killing him instantly. Years later, when Henrietta's cousin Peter looked back on that day, he just shook his bald head and laughed. Henny never was what you'd call a beaten around the bush woman, he said. We should have knew she was trying to tell us something with that storm. The Gila factory. Not long after Henrietta's death, plans began for a Gila factory, a massive operation that would grow to produce trillions of Gila cells each week. It was built for one reason, to help stop polio. By the end of 1951, the world was in the midst of the biggest polio epidemic in history. Schools closed, parents panicked, and the public grew desperate for a vaccine. In February 1952, Jonas Salk at the University of Pittsburgh announced that he developed the world's first polio vaccine, but he couldn't begin offering it to children until he tested it on a large scale to prove it was safe and effective. And doing that would require culturing cells on an enormous industrial scale, which no one had done before. The National Foundation of Infantile Paralysis, NFIP, a charity created by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who'd himself been paralyzed by polio, began operating the largest field trial ever conducted to test the polio vaccine. Salk would inoculate 2 million children, and the NFIP would test their blood to see if they'd become immune. But doing this would require millions of naturalization tests. Which involved mixing blood serum from newly vaccinated children with live poliovirus and cells in culture. If the vaccine worked, the serum from a vaccinated child's blood would block the poliovirus and protect the cells. If it didn't work, the virus would infect the cells, cause damage scientists could see using the microscope. The trouble was, at that point, the cells used in naturalization tests came from monkeys, which were killed in the process. This was a problem, not because of concern for animal welfare, which wasn't the issue then that it is today, but because monkeys were expensive. Doing millions of naturalization tests on monkey cells would cost millions of dollars. So the NFIP went into overdrive, looking for a cultured cell that could grow on a massive scale and would be cheaper than using monkeys. The NFIP turned to Guy and a few other cell culture experts for help, and Guy recognized the opportunity as a gold mine for the field. The NFIP March of Dimes was bringing in an average of $50 million in donations each year, and its director wanted to give much of the money to cell culturists, as they could find a way to mass produce cells, which they've been wanting to do for years anyway. The timing was perfect. By chance, soon after the NFIP contacted Guy for help, he realized that Henrietta's cells grew unlike any human cells he'd seen. Most cells in culture grew in a single layer in a clot on a glass surface, which meant they ran out of space quickly. Increasing their numbers was labor-intensive. Scientists had to repeatedly scrape the cells from one tube and split them into new ones and give them more space. Gila cells, it turned out, weren't picky. They didn't need a glass surface in order to grow. They could grow floating in a culture medium that was constantly stirred by a magnetic device, an important technique Guy developed, now called growing in suspension. That meant that HeLa cells weren't limited by space in the same way other cells were. They could simply divide until they ran out of culture medium. The bigger the vat of medium, the more the cells grew. This discovery meant that if HeLa was susceptible to poliovirus, which not all cells were, it would solve the mass production problem and make it possible to test the vaccine without millions of monkey cells.